a thing that comes into it from having read the book a few times. You read the book a few times and yeah, it's just like the resurrection of the Christ.
Mel Gibson went silent for a moment during the interview before finally saying something that immediately caught people off guard. There's a Bible most of the world has never read. Not a different translation, not a modern rewrite. An ancient collection of scriptures hidden for centuries inside remote Ethiopian monasteries, containing books removed from the version most people know today. Books that speak about fallen angels, corrupt spiritual leaders, the collapse of human morality, and a terrifying prophecy about the final age of humanity that sounds disturbingly similar to the modern world. For nearly 2,000 years, these texts survived in isolation while empires rose and fell around them, preserved by monks who believed the world would someday need to hear what had been hidden inside them. And according to scholars who study these writings, the scariest part isn't what these prophecies say about the end of the world, it's what they say about us. Because the Ethiopian texts describe a future where humanity becomes addicted to distraction, where truth becomes harder to recognize, where false leaders rise from inside religious and political systems, and where people slowly lose the ability to feel anything real at all. The question is, were these ancient monks preserving forgotten history, or were they preserving a warning meant for the future? Tonight, we're diving deep into the Ethiopian Bible, the missing books, the suppressed prophecies, and the terrifying prediction that many believe is unfolding right now. And trust, the deeper this story goes, the darker it gets.
For almost 2,000 years, hidden in mountain monasteries carved into the cliffs of East Africa, there existed a version of the Bible most of the world never knew survived. Not a rewritten Bible, not a modern reinterpretation, an ancient collection of scriptures preserved in near isolation while empires rose, collapsed, and rewrote history around it. And according to researchers who've studied these texts closely, the differences are far bigger than most people realize, because the Ethiopian Bible does not contain 66 books. It contains more than 80. That single fact alone has fueled decades of controversy, not just among theologians, but historians, linguists, and biblical scholars trying to understand how one Christian tradition preserved entire writings the Western world either removed or forgot entirely. Among those texts are books with names most people have barely heard before. The Book of Enoch, Jubilees, Maccabean, ancient writings once circulated among early believers long before the modern biblical canon was finalized. And this is where the story starts getting uncomfortable. Fragments of the Book of Enoch were even discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, proving these writings were known in ancient Jewish communities centuries before Christianity fully emerged. Early church figures quoted from them. Some treated them as sacred. Others believed they revealed mysteries ordinary people were never supposed to fully understand. But over time, many of those writings disappeared from Western Christianity. Ethiopia kept the high and remote monasteries. Monks spent generations copying these manuscripts by hand, using geese, an ancient sacred language almost nobody outside spoke.
The deeper historians dug into the origins of early Christianity, the more chaotic the picture became. Most people imagine the Bible descending through history as one complete, unified book, but that's not what the earliest centuries looked like at all. In the beginning, Christianity was fragmented, scattered across regions, languages, and underground communities trying to survive under the shadow of the Roman Empire. Different churches used different texts. Some communities read writings that others rejected entirely. Letters circulated from city to city, prophecies spread through whispered copies, stories about angels, visions, fallen powers, hidden knowledge, and the nature of the soul moved across the ancient world faster than church leaders could control them. And for a while, nobody fully agreed on what belonged in Scripture. That uncertainty terrified the growing religious authorities, because once Christianity became tied to imperial power under Emperor Constantine, belief was no longer just spiritual, it became political. Stability mattered, unity mattered, control mattered, and suddenly deciding which texts were acceptable carried enormous consequences. This is where the Council of Nicaea enters the story. Now, historians are careful about what Nicaea actually did. Contrary to internet myths, the council didn't simply sit in one room and create the Bible overnight. The process of forming the biblical canon took centuries.
The prophecy begins quietly. No fire falling from the sky, no armies marching across the earth, no dramatic announcement that the world is ending. Just small changes in human behavior. At first, almost nobody notices them. According to several Ethiopian interpretations tied to ancient apocalyptic writings, the collapse of civilization does not begin with destruction. It begins with distraction, a slow spiritual decay, unfolding so gradually
gradual that people mistake it for progress. The texts describe this period as the first stage, the age of forgetting, an era where humanity slowly loses its connection to deeper meaning, not through open rebellion against truth, but through neglect. People stop asking difficult questions. They stop wrestling with purpose, morality, and the condition of the soul. Convenience replaces reflection. Speed replaces wisdom. And over time, entire societies begin drifting without realizing they're drifting at all. What makes this stage disturbing is how ordinary it feels. Somebody wakes up one morning and announces that meaning has disappeared. Life simply becomes louder, faster, more addictive. People become overwhelmed by survival, entertainment, outrage, and endless stimulation. The texts describe a generation constantly consuming information while understanding less and less. A world where attention becomes the most valuable resource on earth. And suddenly, the prophecy stops sounding ancient. Because look around. Millions of people wake up and immediately reach for a screen before speaking a single word. Silence feels uncomfortable now. Stillness feels unnatural. Entire industries are built around keeping human beings distracted every waking second.
According to the Ethiopian texts, the final battle of humanity is not fought with weapons. It is fought with habits, with desires, with fears people don't even realize are controlling. This is where the prophecy introduces something known as the 7 seals of the heart. And unlike the terrifying disasters described in the Book of Revelation, these seals are deeply personal, psychological, internal. The writings describe them as invisible barriers that slowly separate human beings from truth without them noticing it's happening. And the frightening part is how normal they sound. The first seal is the seal of comfort. The idea is simple. Human beings begin avoiding truth the moment truth becomes.
The Ethiopian texts describe the final empire in a way that feels disturbingly different from most traditional end-time stories. There is no single dictator rising from the shadows, no obvious symbol stamped onto the population, no armies forcing people into chains. Instead, the prophecy describes something far more subtle, a system people willingly participate in, a structure so deeply woven into everyday life that most never realize they're inside it at all. According to these writings, the final empire does not control humanity through terror first. It controls humanity through comfort. That's the part researchers keep coming back to. The texts describe a civilization flooded with entertainment, convenience, consumption, and endless distraction. People are given just enough pleasure to remain.
According to the oldest Ethiopian traditions, the final warning Jesus gave his followers was also the most unexpected, because the prophecy never says the world is saved by kings, armies, celebrities, or powerful institutions. It says the turning point begins with ordinary people, hidden people, ignored people. The writings describe a generation rising during the darkest phase of the final age, when corruption feels normal, truth feels unstable, and millions have quietly accepted spiritual emptiness as unavoidable. But this generation reacts differently. They refuse to fully surrender themselves to the system around them, and that refusal becomes the final witness. The prophecy describes these people in strange ways, not as saints descending from heaven, not as flawless heroes. In fact, the texts repeatedly imply they will appear weak by the standards of the world. They will not dominate culture. They will not control governments. Many will be mocked, dismissed, censored, or ignored completely. But according to the writings, they carry something the final empire cannot tolerate: clarity, the ability to still recognize truth inside an age built on confusion. And the prophecy says that clarity spreads quiet, person to person, heart to heart, not through massive institutions, not through political power, but through individuals who refuse to let their humanity die. That idea completely changes the tone of the prophecy, because suddenly the end times stops sounding like a disaster movie and starts sounding like a test of attention, a test of integrity, a test of whether human beings can still recognize what.
Maybe that's the real reason these ancient Ethiopian writings are suddenly spreading across the internet after surviving in silence for nearly 2,000 years. Not because people are searching for another conspiracy, because they're searching for an explanation. Look around at the modern world for even a few minutes, and the similarities become difficult to ignore. Anxiety is everywhere. Attention spans are collapsing. Trust in institutions is falling apart. Millions of people feel constantly connected to everyone around them, while privately feeling more isolated than ever before. And for the first time in a long time, huge numbers of people are beginning to question whether endless comfort and consumption actually made humanity happy or just more distracted. That's why these forgotten prophecies hit so hard today, because whether someone believes them literally or symbolically, the psychological patterns they describe feel deeply familiar. The age of noise, the rise of false shepherds, the obsession with image, the collapse of attention, the emotional numbness, the loss of meaning. These aren't distant warnings, and for many people, they feel like descriptions of daily life. Even scholars who approach these texts cautiously admit something unusual happens when modern readers encounter them. Not fear exactly, recognition.
But there's one final piece of this story that almost nobody talks about, because hidden inside several Ethiopian traditions
humans is a belief far stranger than prophecies about empires, false shepherds, or the collapse of civilization. It's the belief that humanity has been here before, not literally repeating the exact same history, but repeating the same spiritual cycle over and over again. Rise, prosperity, corruption, distraction, collapse, awakening, then the cycle begins again. Some Ethiopian scholars argue the ancient writings were never trying to predict specific modern technologies or world events with exact precision. Instead, they were describing patterns of human behavior that emerge whenever civilizations become too consumed by power, comfort, and self-destruction. That idea changes everything, because suddenly the prophecies stop feeling like fantasy and start feeling psychological. The texts repeatedly suggest the greatest threat to humanity is not war, disease, or natural disaster. It is for— What makes this entire story even more disturbing is that the Ethiopian Bible isn't the only ancient tradition warning about a coming age of deception, distraction, and spiritual collapse. Similar patterns appear across civilizations separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years. Ancient Greek philosophers warned that societies obsessed with pleasure eventually lose the ability to govern themselves wisely. Early desert monks spoke about a future where people would become mentally restless, unable to tolerate silence or stillness for even brief moments. Even some ancient Jewish writers described an age where truth would become blurred, morality inverted, and human beings consumed by different cultures, different languages, different centuries. Yet somehow the warnings sound eerily connected. That's part of why researchers remain fascinated by these Ethiopian texts, even when they disagree. And maybe that's why the story of the Ethiopian Bible refuses to disappear. No matter how many people dismiss it as exaggeration, internet mythology, or fringe speculation, the questions surrounding these ancient texts keep coming back. Why were so many writings left outside the Western canon? Why did isolated monks spend centuries protecting them by hand? And why do so many of these warnings feel more relevant now than they did 100 years ago? Because whether someone sees these manuscripts as divine prophecy, symbolic philosophy, or simply ancient human wisdom, they expose something modern society struggles to confront: the possibility that humanity's greatest crisis is not technological, it's spiritual. For all our progress, modern civilization still seems trapped by the same forces ancient writers feared thousands of years ago: greed, pride, fear, tribalism, distraction, the hunger for power, the addiction to comfort. Only now, those forces operate on a global scale. Algorithms amplify outrage faster than truth. Attention is bought and sold like currency. Entire identities are built online through performance and validation. And millions of people secretly feel exhausted from living inside systems that never allow their minds to fully rest.
There's one last detail about the Ethiopian Bible that makes this entire mystery even harder to ignore. For centuries, the monks preserving these manuscripts believed the texts were not meant to be fully understood all at once. They believed every generation would read them differently, depending on the condition of the world around them. That idea sounds strange at first, until you realize how many people today are reading these ancient warnings and feeling something deeply personal from them. Not because they suddenly converted to ancient theology, but because the emotional atmosphere described in the texts feels painfully familiar. Restlessness, mental exhaustion, loss of meaning, constant noise. A world where people perform happiness while privately struggling with anxiety, loneliness, and emotional emptiness. The Ethiopian writings describe societies becoming spiritually fragmented long before they collapse physically. Communities lose trust in each other. Families become divided. Leaders become obsessed with image instead of wisdom. People become easier to manipulate because fear and distraction keep them mentally overwhelmed. And maybe the strangest part is that the prophecy claims most people won't recognize the danger while it's happening, because the collapse arrives disguised as progress. That line gets different today. Modern society moves faster every year. More technology, more stimulation, more convenience, more artificial intelligence, more virtual lives replacing real. Human beings spend increasing amounts of time staring into screens while spending less time. So after everything, the hidden manuscripts, the missing books, the prophecies about distraction, false shepherds, spiritual numbness, and the final empire, one question still remains. Why now? Why are millions of people suddenly becoming fascinated by forgotten texts preserved for centuries in isolated Ethiopian monasteries? Maybe because the modern world has created conditions no previous civilization ever faced before. Human beings are now surrounded by non-stop stimulation every hour of the day. Silence has almost disappeared. Attention is constantly under attack. Algorithms compete aggressively to shape emotions, beliefs, fears, desires, and even identity itself. And for many people, life no longer feels real. It feels performed, curated, filtered through screens. The Ethiopian writings warned about a world exactly like this. A world where people become so overwhelmed by noise
ways that they lose contact with their own inner voice.
And maybe that's the most haunting part of this entire story. Not the missing books, not the hidden monasteries, not even the prophecies themselves. It's the possibility that humanity was warned long ago about exactly the kind of world we would eventually create. A world overflowing with information, but starving for wisdom. A world more connected than ever before, yet emotionally isolated. A civilization obsessed with appearance, speed, and endless stimulation, while slowly losing touch with silence, reflection, and meaning. The Ethiopian monks who preserved these writings lived completely differently from the modern world. Many spent years in isolation, fasting, praying, copying manuscripts by hand, under candlelight, in remote mountain monasteries, cut off from the noise of civilization. To modern people, that life sounds extreme, but according to these traditions, silence was never empty. It was protection. Protection from distraction, from ego, from manipulation, from becoming so consumed by the external world that the inner world disappears entirely. And maybe that's what the prophecy was really trying to preserve. Not secret knowledge, awareness. The writings repeatedly warn that societies become dangerous when human beings lose the ability to examine themselves honestly, when everything becomes reactive.
So, in the end, maybe the Ethiopian Bible was never truly hidden at all. Maybe the world simply wasn't ready to listen. For centuries, these manuscripts sat quietly inside mountain monasteries, while empires obsessed with conquest, wealth, politics, and control. Generations of monks continued copying the same warnings by hand, preserving them through wars, invasions, famine, and the collapse of entire kingdoms, because they believed the message mattered more than the survival of any empire. That alone says something powerful, because people do not protect words for 2,000 years unless they believe those words contain truth worth saving. Whether someone sees these writings as sacred prophecy or symbolic philosophy, the core warning feels impossible to ignore now. Human beings are losing themselves in distraction. The modern world moves so fast that many people no longer know how to exist without constant stimulation. Silence feels comfortable.
So maybe the Ethiopian monks were never trying to predict the future in the way people imagine. Maybe they were trying to warn future generations about something far more dangerous than war, disaster, or the collapse of empires. The slow collapse of the human spirit. Because when you strip away all the mystery surrounding the Ethiopian Bible, the hidden manuscripts, and the forbidden prophecies, the core message becomes surprisingly simple. A civilization can survive poverty, it can survive conflict, it can even survive catastrophe. But once people become too distracted to think, too emotionally exhausted to care, and too spiritually numb to recognize truth anymore, that civilization begins collapsing from inside, long before anybody notices it externally. And honestly, that may be why these ancient writings suddenly feel so terrifying to modern audiences. Not because they describe monsters or supernatural destruction, because they describe us, a world addicted to stimulation, a world drowning in noise, a world where people scroll endlessly searching for meaning while slowly forgetting how to sit alone with their own thoughts. The Ethiopian texts warned that the final age would not arrive through obvious chains. It would arrive through comfort, through distraction, through endless entertainment powerful enough to keep humanity spiritually asleep while believing it was fully awake. And maybe that's the most chilling part of all. Because if the prophecy is right, then the greatest battle of our time is not happening between nations, religions, or political parties. It's happening inside the human mind itself. The battle for attention, for truth, for consciousness, for the soul. But the manuscripts also leave humanity with one final promise, that no matter how dark the age becomes, people can still wake up, still choose awareness over distraction, still choose truth over comfort, still choose humanity over numbness. Maybe that's why these forgotten writings survived for nearly 2,000 years, hidden in silence, while entire empires disappeared around them, because the monks preserving them believed a generation would eventually arrive that needed this warning more than any generation would. Maybe that generation is ours. And maybe the real question isn't whether these prophecies are true. Maybe the real question is this: if humanity can already feel itself drifting, will anyone choose to wake up before the silence becomes permanent? If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and turn on notifications for more hidden history, ancient mysteries, forbidden texts, and the stories powerful people tried to erase from history. Because the deeper you dig into the past, the more terrifyingly connected it becomes to the world we're living right now.